An imminent Iranian attack. Defense correspondent Jonathan Regev reports.
There won't be any war with the help of God. We don't seek a war, and they don't either.
These comments coming from Iran may signal a somewhat softer tone, but if you thought they will also serve as some kind of a call for renewed negotiations, think again.
A negotiation between us and America is poison, as far as America is what it is now.
Iran is desperate to find a way to alleviate its economic hardships, which only got worse following the latest round of American sanctions. If Iran is not seeking a war, but will also not negotiate, the third option might be terror attacks without claiming responsibility. This is what may have happened earlier this week in the waters of the Persian Gulf. And intelligence regarding future attacks may also be what led the State Department to remove some of the American personnel from Iraq.
We hope that things will end well, and there are indications from both parties that things will end well, and there is a real desire to find outlets for the crisis.
If things do get out of hand, there is always the risk Iran will attack U.S. allies in the area, Israel among them. Iran has militias operating in Lebanon and Syria, which could be used for this purpose. But if they do, they run the risk of enraging all the players who are unhappy with the Iranian presence in Syria.
I think the Israeli Prime Minister, the Syrian President, the President Rouhani, and even the President of the United States and the Russian President share the same interests to see the Iranians out of Syria.
As a mixture of threatening and calming messages is being sent from both parties, it seems as if no one is interested in war, but one wrong move could take them there. Jonathan Regev, I-24 News.
Senior Fellow at the Security Studies Group, Matthew Brodsky, joins us from Washington, D.C. and with me in studio here in Tel Aviv, our Middle East correspondent, Emily Rose, and our defence correspondent, Daniel Tsemach. Now, Matthew, talk us through what this means, the fact that we're seeing the US pull its staff from its diplomatic mission in Iraq. What is this telling us?
I think that it's, first of all, out of caution, because if something were to happen and our personnel were there would be a lot of finger pointing. But beyond that, I don't think it's just trying to increase tension the way some in the media here in the United States are trying to portray this as not really that big of a threat environment. So this is just for show. I disagree with that viewpoint. There is, in fact, a heightened threat matrix coming from a lot of parts of the Middle East, and there's reason for the United States to have more military assets in the region and to act out of an abundance of caution.
Right, but Matt, why would Iran launch an attack knowing full well it would see US retaliation?
I think the game for Iran right now is to have the United States back into the Iran deal or to negotiate to get some relief of pressure. So the intended audience is really Europe. They want Europe to essentially apply a lot of pressure onto the United States, and so that Europe would blame the U.S. for causing this type of pattern of behavior from Iran. But of course, this is the behavior that is part of Iran's playbook. It went unaddressed in the nuclear deal to begin with, and the United States, of course, should say in response to such pressure that if this is how Iran behaves right now without nuclear weapons, then Iran with nuclear weapons would be a far, far bigger threat.
All right, so Emily, let's talk about how tense this situation really is, or rather whether it is, I suppose, just a seemingly tense situation building up in the Gulf. What would have to happen for this to escalate into a real conflict?
Well, Tracy, what we're seeing now is a little bit of echoes from what we saw pre-Iraq war with the Bush administration. First of all, there is intelligence, or there was intelligence, perhaps given that that Iran was posing a threat to the U.S., though the transparency of that intelligence wasn't exactly clear, quite similar to what we saw leading up to Iraq. The same thing with deploying 120,000 troops. That's quite similar to what we saw deployed offshores to Iraq from the U.S. administration. We also know that Pompeo, as well as Bolton, they've been pretty clear in the past, even in writing in op-eds and in public statements about their plans, even in the past administrations, supporting the war in Iraq and supporting some kind of sort of military operation against Iran. There is a will in this administration to take some sort of military action against Iran. General Mattis was known to be the sort of curtailer of that will. We know that he's out of the picture now. So it could be that this is fertile ground for this administration to launch some kind of a strike.
But Daniel, Britain's foreign minister initially saying that Iran and the United States could trigger a conflict by accident. That was when, of course, Jeremy Hunt landed in Brussels at the top of the week, where we know Secretary of State Mike Pompeo met there with European leaders. How dicey is this situation?
Well, he also said that really at the backdrop of an incident that really seemed to maybe be the type of example of an accident that could really have a ripple effect, that could bring the two sides to a direct confrontation, that being those 4 vessels that were sabotaged or struck or damaged or whatever, what have you, off the coast of the UAE. Now, that sort of incident absolutely could result in a much larger confrontation. That's just the nature of things in a volatile area. When you have military action that's done by accident, whether it's a ship that's perceived to be in waters that are not in, that it doesn't have the jurisdiction to be in, and thus resulting in shots fired towards that ship that we've seen in the past, doesn't necessarily translate to a war, but it definitely creates a sort of environment and dynamic that's much more fragile, and that is something that people are definitely looking at very closely, both whether it be international leaders or security experts, that it could result in something like those sabotage vessels off the UAE coast that could result in a confrontation between the two sides, whether it be forces, American forces in the Middle East already, whether it be Israel, whether it be any other allied force of the United States and the Iranian forces.
Now, Matthew, to you in Washington, D.C., we know this is all due to the fact that President Trump is trying to, for lack of a better word, strong-arm Iran back to the negotiating table to negotiate for a better nuclear deal. There is concern that Trump's maximum pressure campaign might not, in fact, force Iran to yield, but instead put the country back on a path to renuclearization, and we have heard threats of that nature from Iran. So what's more likely?
Well, first of all, if Iran were to stay by the deal, then it could, of course, emerge from the deal with a sunset clause fairly soon and race itself or slowly creep out toward having a nuclear power or nuclear weapon in the future. So the fact is, this is a maximum campaign pressure, finally, which is making Iran act out of desperation. I do think, however, it's very important to point out that the talking point about some kind of spiraling out of control toward some major conflict, it doesn't work the same between the United States and other powers as it does between Israel and Syria or Iran. The fact is, these are conscious decisions made by leaders. If an attack were to happen on the United States, you don't wake up the next day and find yourself in a giant war. That's not how it works. These are decisions. It's not the same thing as Israel in Gaza or Israel against Hezbollah.
All right, what's your take, Emily?
I have to say that the 4 oil tankers that we saw that were damaged, they belong to the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And if we look at the Middle East, as it always breaks down, there's a Saudi UAE sort of Sunni axis versus the Shiite axis. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, they're quite interested in seeing the United States hit back at Iran in any way it can. And we know that Iran, as we've mentioned, wouldn't likely strike the United States directly, but would likely try to use its proxy powers, as it has been doing in the Middle East, hitting U.S. allies like the UAE, like arming Houthi rebels in Yemen, or like striking Israel, one of the American U.S. allies in the region. That's more likely how we would see a counterstrike. The question is here, though, because we've seen murmurings from both Pompeo and Bolton that both those types of activities by Iran would constitute an attack on the United States. Therefore, the justification, at least in lip service and in rhetoric, seems to be that it's pointing to some kind of a justification for a larger strike on Iran.
Now, how is Israel reacting to these building tensions between Iran and the U.S.?
Well, first, it has to be said that what Emily just said is absolutely true. We have seen and heard from especially Secretary of State Mike Pompeo things we haven't heard in the past, and that's specifically what Emily just mentioned, saying that that sort of strike would be interpreted as an Iranian strike, that Hezbollah striking Israel, for example, could be interpreted in that way. But off of what Matt said, it is true that these things don't happen by accident. It's calculated. It doesn't happen necessarily haphazardly, although it can. As I said before, things do happen by accident, especially in volatile times, in volatile waters, and in volatile areas. But in regards to Iran's ability to attack Israel with its proxies, it's very simple. And there are actually some Israeli security experts specifically that do interpret the latest escalation between Israel and Palestinian factions in Gaza of having some influence of Iran. Palestinian Islamic Jihad is factually supported by Iran. This is no secret. They have massive funding from Iran, and it's very possible that Iran is pushing them to strike Israel and to disobey the orders of Hamas, for example. This is something that exists. This sentiment does exist in the Israeli security expert establishment, if you will, and it's something that Israel is also looking at. Iran's influence not only through the nuclear ambitions, but also their ambitions to strike Israel or U.S. allies through its proxies.
So, Matt, to you in D.C., with all these pieces of the puzzle, I suppose, in play, we've seen the President of Switzerland now making this last-minute visit to the United States to speak with President Donald Trump. What's the U.S. going to be asking of Switzerland?
Look, I think the United States has been fairly consistent under the administration with Europe. I mean, Europe still wants to stick to a deal that is essentially patching up holes on a sinking ship. So that's not in Trump's interest. So what they don't want to see is Europe create this other kind of vehicle for financing what essentially would be terrorist activity from Iran to try to skirt sanctions. So it is to have maximum pressure on Iran. And if Iran's response to maximum pressure is to try to heighten the sense of impending military conflict, then Washington is going to stand resolute with its allies, as it tends to do, and will obviously stand shoulder to shoulder without daylight with Israel. I think that's a message that Europe needs to understand and not embrace a line of appeasement, which I think will simply kick the can down the road closer to a point where Iran will be able to have a nuclear weapon. And then this conflict right here, right now, is far more dangerous.
So, Emily, Iran's Rouhani said it's enduring worse economic conditions than it did during its war with Iraq in the 80s. Why does Iran not want a new deal then? In what way is it concerned it will come off worse off?
Tracy, it's important to remember that domestically, Rouhani really bit the bullet when he signed his name onto the JCPOA. We have to remember that in Iran, and this is put in sort of in brackets, he's seen as a moderate on the scale in comparison to other leaders we've seen in the past in Iran, or what we could see in Iran today. Coming to sign the JCPOA, he wasn't seen favorably by hardliners in Iran who really opposed the United States. And the fact that Iran has upheld, as it sees, its end of the deal doesn't make it look strong when it goes to take even another deal that the United States decides to put amendments on. Now, it's absolutely true what the Trump administration officials are saying now, that nothing in the deal actually demarked or addressed the issue that Iran is funding terror in all these different proxies across the Middle East. It was not stipulated in the deal. It wasn't part of it. So now the idea that they want to add another clause or bring this up as another issue in a renewed deal, well, that seems to be legitimate. But if the supreme leader of Iran, if Rouhani is going to pitch that to the Iranian people, he might see himself fall even further spiral and out of popularity.
Right, well, the pressure valve is certainly high. Matthew Brodsky, thanks for that insight from Washington, D.C., and our very own Emily Rose and Daniel Tsemach. Thank you. After the break, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu